Okay, so again, it's Liz Grizzaro. So welcome to the third in our series of technical conferences on the coordinated grid planning process. I believe Tammy Mitchell is here and would like to give a welcome. Tammy?
Sure, thanks, Liz. Yeah, this is Tammy Mitchell, Director of the Office of Electric, Gas, and Water for DPS. So again, I would also like to welcome everyone to today's Coordinated Grid Planning Process Technical Conference. As Liz pointed out, this is our third in the series, and today's conference is on modeling and scenario development. As always, I encourage engagement and participation in today's conference. I really believe these have been very helpful in gathering input and developing the Cgpp. And I also want to thank the utilities ahead of time for the thoughtful presentation they'll be giving. And again, I look forward to the rest of the conference. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Liz.
Thanks very much, Tammy. Thanks for that. I'll just briefly review the plan for the day, which is we have presentations from first the New York ISO and second from the joint utilities. We'll proceed much as we have before. We will take some time for questions after the NISO's presentation. Please drop your questions into the chat as they occur to you, and we'll try to make sure we cover everything. Then we may take a quick break, and then we'll hear from the utilities. And once the utilities close out their presentation, again, we'll open up the field for questions. Please use the chat if you can, and if there's time and more questions, we'll go to we can go to live questions as well. I want to make one note and ask you to be thinking a little bit about this as you are hearing from the presenters about approaches to modeling and scenario development, and that is we had a request from one participating party, New York Best, to have a follow-up working group meeting following this open technical conference. Some folks might recall that we said we would be happy to try to facilitate, more detailed working group sessions where it seemed like there was a need to do that. So since we've had the one request, if you would be thinking about what kinds of questions you think would remain to be worked on in a smaller group setting, what topics or items that maybe are not completely addressed here that would be valuable to dive into a little bit further, please make note of those kinds of questions, and I'll be asking folks to send those in so we can have some idea of what the scope of a further discussion might be, and help prepare for that appropriately. So that said, our first presenter is the New York ISO, and are we ready to go?
Hi, Liz. This is Jason Frazier from the New York ISO. Just want to make sure you can hear me okay.
Yes, Jason. Thanks and welcome. We can hear you just fine.
Thank you. So do you have the presentation and want to drive, or should I kind of pull it up on my side?
That's a good question. Jalila or Jason, can we put up the presentations, or are we asking the presenters? I think to date we've had the presenters do it. So if you can, that'd be great.
Yeah, typically we've been asking the presenters to just kind of drive the slideshows. If you need to, we can as well.
Okay, give me 1 second. I'm going to pull it up.
Okay, you're visible.
Okay, I'll get started then, Liz. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Frazier. I'm the manager of the Economic Planning Department here at the NISO. And today, or this afternoon, I'll be going over brief presentation on a little bit about the NISO's planning department, about the Economic Planning Department System and Resource Outlook study, and into that, talking a bit more about the capacity expansion model that we use in our study work. So about the NISO's System and Resource Planning Department, also known as SRP oftentimes, we have 4 core tenets of what we do in planning, with splits in different departments, but a lot of integration between. So first and foremost, we comprehensively plan the system and resources out through the future. That might mean 20 to 30 to 50 years at times, depending on what type of analysis we're doing, all the way back to a 2 or 3 year time scale. Beyond that, we have interconnection department, and the sole goal of that department is to reliably interconnect new generation, load, and transmission to the system. We have a forecasting department that accurately forecasts our short-term and long-term electricity demand, market operations, and planning. And that work is key into NISO's budgeting process. And lastly, we independently provide information to stakeholders in a public forum to provide information in data so decisions can get made in our state by stakeholders in the most clear and transparent manner possible. So those are 4 really core tenets of what we do in planning, and of course a lot of details and a lot of department, a lot of hours and work that goes into all of these. So digging in a little bit further, we have what we call the Comprehensive System Planning Process, or the CSPP. And this process houses effectively 3 of our departments: the Reliability Planning Department, which has a couple sub-departments, our Economic Planning Department, as well as our Public Policy Transmission Planning Department. And the 3 processes within these departments are highlighted or kind of outlined in 3 different colors here, and work down in vertical in a vertical format. But you can really see that the arrows in this diagram are showing how we have a lot of information that goes back and forth between our departments and really inform the studies in a kind of collaborative manner. So you can see reliability planning process has reliability needs assessment and the comprehensive reliability plan are 2 main products that are likely to have been seen coming from this department. From the Economic Planning Department, historically, you would have seen the CARIS study, or Congestion Assessment Resource Integration Study, but work has been done over the last 2 years to modify that study and really improve it, and it's now known as the System and Resource Outlook Study. So if anyone's seeing that name for the first time, that's really the replacement for CARIS. And then lastly here you see the Public Policy Department, and the public policy transmission planning process occurs there. And of course there's reports and publications and analyses that go on there that are currently ongoing and have happened in the past. So that's really a high level overview. There's a lot more going on too on this chart, but I wanted to make sure that everyone really sees those 3 departments. And of course my department, Economic Planning, is where we house the System and Resource Outlook, and of course run our capacity expansion models. So the System and Resource Outlook, I put a little excerpt here from our report, and what you'll oftentimes see, it's a really good description of what it is. It provides a comprehensive overview of system resources and transmission constraints through New York, highlighting opportunities for transmission investment driven by economics and policy. So I feel like it's a really good description of what our overarching goal is with the study, and would add a little bit of providing as much information publicly as possible to help guide our stakeholders in decision making. So going in a little bit deeper on what we call the policy case in the System and Resource Outlook. So I guess just to back up 1 second, the Outlook study itself is actually currently ongoing, where we've wrapped up all of the analyses, the simulations, and we're into the phase right now where we're writing the report and publishing draft versions of the report. The final report is aiming to be published in August of this year. So there's a lot of new information out there that maybe folks haven't seen yet. But the best way to describe how we've split the system and resource outlook study up is we have three primary cases or future scenarios we look at. One is a baseline, kind of a business as usual case. The second is a contract case. That's really business as usual plus renewable contracts that have been procured. And lastly, we have a policy case. And the policy case process is highlighted very well on this diagram. And it's quite a bit more complicated than the contract or the base case, in that we've had to introduce several new models to the process in order to capture potential achievement of the policies through CLCPA. So you'll see on the left the starting point for the policy case is really the capacity expansion model that we've developed. And what we do there is we feed in different inputs and run many different scenarios to help determine potential future capacity build-outs and retirements that achieve policy objectives. And then kind of everything on the right here you see is feeding information from those scenarios or the selected scenarios from that case that then goes on to our production cost simulations with many different feedback loops that occur in our process to best integrate our models. So this is a really good high-level overview of the different tools we're using in the process that we're using to go about our analysis. So a little more about capacity expansion planning. Really, it is a forecasting tool that is highly dependent on input assumptions that we provide it. And what the tool does is it co-optimizes generation capital costs and operating costs in a manner to achieve kind of least cost build out to the system through time. And with that, you know, we're able to model out the policy objectives directly into that model. So it's performing the least cost optimization in a way to really achieve policy objectives and meeting and balancing load and generation. How does it do it? It's an optimization software, so a linear program or a mixed integer program. Both options are available. And there's a detailed database that feeds this optimization to run the simulation itself. Why did we introduce it? I covered a little bit on the last slide, but we really wanted to have a good tool that provides several or many different scenarios for potential policy achievement that would then allow us to layer those future generation capacity build-outs into a production cost model and really dig in on the challenges that might occur on our system so we can identify those, potentially get ahead of those, and inform stakeholders of what we're seeing. And then lastly, we're at the NISO right now, but obviously outside the NISO, this is being used also, but in system resource planning and market design are two areas that are currently using capacity expansion models. So a little bit deeper, so we say the capacity expansion is simulating optimal investment and retirement of resources. I talked about that a little bit more before. And what we can get from it is, or at least on the input side, some variables that we're able to adjust to understand how different futures might cause different build-outs. We can tweak our load forecasts. Different policy constraints can be adjusted or included or excluded. The investment costs of technologies and generation, technological progress or limits. So that might look like total amounts of certain capacity on the system for a technology, or say declining costs due to innovation through time, the operating cost of generation, and then finally, it does have the capability to do generation versus transmission trade-offs and decide which type of technology is more beneficial or least cost. So this slide shows a pretty good picture that I like to show on what the optimization's actually doing. So we have capital costs, which are really the costs of building new assets on the system. We have production costs, which are the costs of operating those assets on the system. And then on the right, you can see a chart that shows cost on the vertical axis and the number of, say, assets that are built. So you can see that the tendency on capital cost is as you build more, the cost to actually to actually build your system, the more and more generation you build on it, the more costly it is. So that's kind of your increasing cost line. And then your declining cost line is the more assets you have on your system. Generally, the cost to operate those or to meet your objectives goes down. So say overbuilding a system actually costs a lot less from an operational perspective, but certainly would cost a lot more in a capital cost perspective. So looking above those, there is a minimum location for the optimization to search for or to identify that really optimizes or co-optimizes between those capital and production costs to find a location that achieves objectives at the minimum cost. So the process using capacity expansion in economic planning, right now we're using it to do many things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but go through a couple things, is what type of generation gets built and why. So if we model our targets for CLCPA, we of course know we'll meet those targets because they're hardwired in the program, but above and beyond that, targets such as 70 by 30 and 100 by 40, there's still flexibility that more generation has to be built, and the capacity expansion helps to identify the most optimal way to achieve those policies. We can identify the zones that generation gets built in and by type. So we have a pipe and bubble zonal model that is fairly high fidelity that helps us understand the zones where generation gets built. And each zone does have different cost parameters around it for building that generation. When does it get built? So it's a multi-year simulation, so we can identify when through time generation gets selected. And then we can output the capital or the operating costs of each build. So we can identify the total cost of the system under different scenarios to see the cost of achieving CLCPA objectives. And then lastly, the what type of opportunities are there for interzonal transmission or intrazonal transmission to be economic according to our model. And I do see there's a couple questions out there. I actually take them at the end just to make sure that I get through the presentation in a reasonable amount of time. So about our planning process and where the capacity expansion model fits in, we've used that model to develop preferable zonal generation buildouts between 2021 and 2040 to meet our objectives. We then, as I mentioned, feed this information. We actually selected two scenarios with differing buildouts between 2021 and 2040 to go on and do production cost analyses on, which provides a much higher fidelity analysis of what's happening from an operations perspective, as well as on the transmission system. And we use that to identify the challenges that we might run into. Specifically, strong focus on local transmission that might be causing curtailment on the system, or bulk level transmission that could also be impeding achievement of policy objectives. And I mentioned earlier too, but our final report is set for release in August, and our draft reports are being published kind of live now. So we do have the ability, or everyone here has the ability to go to the NYSA website and find what our draft reports are saying, and also really dig into the detailed material that we publish. And this gives you a good flavor for the types of information that we're using to feed our model that are interlinked with the production cost database in really what feeds the analysis itself and helps us identify those optimal build-outs. And a little bit about NISO's collaboration and interaction with the CGPP. So NISO's, the stakeholders, any stakeholder is welcome to comment and review the NISO study, including our assumptions or reports under our analyses on a public forum. We do have a public information session that happens after the final report is published in August. So it's likely late August or September timeframe where we'll go over the kind of final takeaways and the process itself in that public information session. The assumptions are developed for the system and resource outlook. All of the assumptions are highly detailed in several documents on our website and posted. So all of that information is available. And the NISO does recommend that many of these assumptions be used as a starting point for local transmission distribution planning for the CGPP. And then lastly, the NISO does participate in the CGPP as a stakeholder, and right now are in discussions with the joint utilities and other stakeholders on the next steps for our process. Okay, so that's it for my presentation. But I think, Liz, there's a couple questions out there. I'm going to try to go see if I can start going through them.
Yep, I think basically one question from Mark Richardson on the first one there, when thinking about capital cost of new gen, who's that cost attributed to? LSEs, ratepayers, state, private investors? What does the NISO make any such attribution in its planning study?
Yeah, so there's no real attribution on who that the burden of that cost is attributed to. So presumably, capital cost to build a new generator would be attributed to the developer that builds that generator. But of course, there's many complexities on financing and any of the finance related things that go on with the development of a project itself. So we don't go on to make that attribution. We simply recognize that a capital cost exists, and capital costs for different technologies are different, and we model those out to the best of our ability.
Thanks for that. And then the second question comes from Rick Schuler. Hope you can address this one. How is storage factored into the optimization of generation and transmission?
Okay, great question. So we do include storage in our model, and storage has a capital cost associated with it and is enabled to both charge and discharge within the model and contribute to energy shifting as well as contribute to meeting capacity requirements in the system. So it is a technology that can be selected by the model itself to both achieve policy objectives as well as capacity and energy requirements.
Great, thanks for that. I don't have any other questions in the chat, but we have a little time if anybody wants to use the raise hand function for open question on the phone. Aaron Hogan. Yes, Aaron. Can you unmute yourself?
I think I unmuted. I think I was triple muted this time around. Jason, apologies. I joined a little late. I'm interested in knowing, though, if you explained to this broader group how the Plexos model adds or retires capacity, and that in many resource expansion models do this, but I think it's important for this broader group to understand that. And if you have well.
Erin, you broke up a little bit just at the end there.
I was just saying that it would be helpful for this broader group to understand how the resource expansion model adds and retires capacity.
Okay.
I think the point that I'm trying to make is it's incremental to the reserve margin, I believe, and I think that would be helpful for this group to understand.
Okay, thanks. That was clear. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Aaron. So, first and foremost, any capacity added to the system has a cost added or associated with it, and it has a both capital cost as well as an operating cost. So we did go through a slide that talks about overall what the optimization's doing to optimize capital versus operating costs. But to add capacity in the system, it has to, or at least the model recognizes that there is a load pattern or load shapes on the system. It has to meet that load for every time increment that is modeled. But above and beyond that is also incorporating the capacity requirements and reserve margins that exist on the system or are projected to exist through time. So we're really building out to, and I guess on top of that, it's worth mentioning that the policy objectives are layered onto that also. So it has to really, the model itself has to balance out minimization of costs, but at the same time meet both the energy and capacity requirements for reliability in order to actually, perform its job. So it's able to do that and provides a solution that meets all those objectives.
Yeah, and second, if you don't mind, I just want to expand on it and be a little more explicit. Just for everyone's benefit, what that means is the model will add increments that are not necessarily aligned with a unit size. So for example, a nuclear unit may be designated to retire just a few megawatts of its overall large size. And I think it's important for people to understand that, because what that means is that there's a judgment call transitioning from this GC, whatever we're calling it, this planning process, and as it will dovetail potentially as what ultimately is decided with the TOs. And so there are those incremental judgment calls that I think we need to be cognizant of. Jason, the one other thing I wanted to make sure that I recall correctly, and I think it's important for the broader group to understand as well, is the reserve margin is an input to the Plexos expansion model. Am I correct?
That's correct, Aaron. It is
Okay.
reserve margin as well as the locational capacity requirements.
Okay. And I'm just thinking through, and I don't know with your experience, maybe you could fill in my thought process. The LOLE meets this reserve, so you're adding capacity to meet the reserve margin specified based on, meeting the 1 in 10. Because, and I think this might answer my own question, because your input assumptions are based on availability factors, essentially UCAP, that should be consistent regardless of what the reserve margin is. Am I mistaken on that?
No, you've got it right. We effectively modeled, rather than the IRM, we modeled the URM, which incorporates the kind of translation to UCAP for different unit types. So it's consistent through the model.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll put my hand down now.
Thanks, Erin. Did we have anybody else wanting to raise a question here while we have a couple more minutes? Okay. Looks like not. In that case, we'll turn to the utilities who are, responsible for the Cgpp that's on file now, and we'll be making a revised filing later at the end of this year. And to hear about their take on capacity expansion modeling. Are you guys ready to go? And who's going to be presenting today?
Hi, Liz. Yes, this is Howard Kosel from Con Edison.
Hi,
I'll be
Howard.
presenting.
Great.
How are you?
Thank you. Yep. And can you manage your own slides?
Yep, no problem.
Very good. I think Jason has to stop sharing. Okay, good.
Yeah, there we go. I think we're good. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to go over some of our thoughts on capacity expansion modeling and scenario development. Just real quick agenda, just we'll go over some context setting, just review again what the Cgpp objective is. Jason just described what capacity expansion is, so we won't touch on that too much, but we'll talk about how we plan to utilize that in the Cgpp process. And then the rest of the presentation really revolves around developing input assumptions and coming up with different scenarios that will be used in the Cgpp. So just some context setting. These plans remain in development right now. This is our thinking as of today, and obviously, trying to build on and use these technical conferences to get folks' input and feedback and try and improve the process as we continue to develop it going forward. Just an overview of what the Cgpp is, again, just to recap. It's really to identify expansion of the local transmission and distribution system to help unlock renewable capacity and energy to help meet the state's goals. And this will kind of serve as a statewide integrated resource planning process. And then on the right, in the graphic there, kind of lays out a couple different phases of the Cgpp. And we're going to focus on the top one today, just capacity expansion and scenario development. So scenarios, just real quick, first on that is we're going to cover that more in later slides, but that's going to be something that's going to be developed based on stakeholder feedback. Capacity expansion modeling, again, Jason really just described it, so I'm not going to really cover it too much, but it's basically coming up with a zonal least cost generation build out to meet the specified goals of the CLCPA. Some of the goals are just listed down below, obviously. And so just before we go into the scenario development, just utilization of the capacity expansion results. So as it is now, as what Jason just described, the capacity expansion model is zonal, the pipe and bubble model now. So, it's coming up with how much wind, solar needs to be built in zone A, B, C, and so forth. So the utilities, need to take those results and translate them into the powerful model so they can do more detailed analysis. So that's going to be a process in and of itself. Translating those zonal results and just placing them on different nodes in the system. Obviously the utilities have a lot of information and knowledge of their local systems, where there's headroom available now, where some of the best places to interconnect are. But again, that will be part of the stakeholder process, taking any feedback that there might be, in how that siting is done. And the idea is basically to site the generation, identify system constraints, and then basically, what type of projects can be developed to basically effectuate the capacity expansion build out that came out of the capacity expansion model. Okay. So getting into developing input assumptions and scenarios. So, the CGPP is going to kick off with a set of stakeholder-led exercises to ensure that, the best data available is being used. Tying it all together, reviewing the data and key input assumptions, education and learning and cross-training among the utility planners as well as the stakeholders. And then eventually lessons learned. Obviously, this is the first CGPP cycle, so maybe not lessons learned from this right now, but in the future, however the first cycle plays out, apply lessons learned for future CGPP cycles. This is just a list of some of the potential information resources available, stakeholders to look through and inform scenario development. I'm not going to read through all of them, but we can look to what Jason just kind of went through. The NISO system and resource outlook sounds like it would be a very good source of information. Load forecast for the gold.
Hi, Vanessa. Give me a.
I think you're okay, Howard.
Yeah, I'm good. I don't know who that was. So these are just a list of some of the potential sources of information. Certainly not exhaustive, but just a high level look. And then, so getting into scenario development. So this is where the key role of the Energy Policy Planning Advisory Council (EPAC) will come into play. EPAC is going to be tasked with evaluating, all the different resources, the views of the stakeholders, and helping to direct the evaluation of, our thinking is up to 3 distinct generation build-out scenarios in order to maintain the planned time frame of 18 to 24 months. So, we just want to stress with the current time frame and the 3 distinct generation build out scenarios, it's a very timely process. So more scenarios could be added, but it would be very difficult to maintain that 18 to 24 month timeline. So what we propose to kind of handle that is sensitivities on the scenarios. And what is a sensitivity? So the sensitivity being, the scenarios would be fully run through the capacity expansion, model results fed into the power flow, whereas sensitivities would be just running the capacity expansion model and seeing how that changes the generation build out. And again, that would not be fed in to the remaining stages of the CGPP. So, no power flow analysis would be done there. And the point of these sensitivities would be to inform policymakers, potentially inform future CGP cycles as well. And our thinking is, at minimum, one sensitivity would be to include an analysis of relaxing some of the bulk transfer limits, and that would be included in the report. And again, other sensitivities can be done, and for informational purposes, but again, they won't be run through the entire, exhaustive power flow analysis that plans to be done for all the scenarios. And with that, I think that's all I had.
Great. It's Liz. Thanks, Howard. That was a nice summary. I'd like to, before we go to the chat, I'd like to ask both participants just briefly to kind of situate everybody. We heard the Outlook is a tariff program that the NISO is running that looks at some of these generation build out questions, and we heard about what you're proposing in the CGPP, to kind of illuminate some of the same things. How are these things going to work together? Are you planning to rely on the NISO Outlook for some of this effort? Are you going to be in the the long term? Is your proposal to integrate the outlook into this process, or to carry out something that's entirely independent? Maybe you could both answer that.
So I can answer. I think the idea is to integrate it. I know there's some potential proposals at the NISO for project prioritization for some extra funding, basically, that could help the NISO, be able to do some of this work.
Liz, this is Yachiwen from New York ISO. If it's
Yeah.
okay, I'd like to step in and help out with this question. So, for everyone in the conference, my name is Yachiwen. I am Senior Manager Transmission Planning in the New York ISO. So I work with Jason extensively on economic planning. So the role of NISO's economic planning process is we aim to identify opportunities to develop transmission that economically, and in doing so, the ultimate goal is in accomplishing this goal. We have to develop a system outlook on what a potential path could be. So this is where capacity expansion comes in very handy from the level that we're doing the bulk side of the planning. And Liz, to your question, how we envision to continue to work with the state agencies and the JUs is that in NISO's economic planning study, we identify what the potential issue can be in achieving this energy future. And then what the solution may be would be up to such as the local transmission planning or as the public policy, and all integrated into the overall bulk planning plus the Cgpp. So I'll stop right there. Happy to answer questions.
Yep. No, I just wanted to make sure people could understand a little bit how these pieces might contribute to each other or be integrated. One of our objectives here is to make sure that even though we may have different entities carrying out different portions of the work, that the Cgpp as a whole provides the commission with quality information for decision making. So with that, I only have a couple of questions in the chat. One, I'll just answer myself, which is, there's a questioner wants to know what stakeholders will be part of the EPAC. The membership and the role of the EPAC are both proposed in the JU December filing. They included this idea of the EPAC in that proposal. So you'll see more details there about who would be represented. It would not be open to all stakeholders. It would be open to essentially different representatives of different stakeholder communities. But you should go to the filing to see what the JU have put on the table. And one of our sessions, if we have time, we're going to try to do a session here on the composition and function of the EPAC. We're going to try to run a technical conference around some of those questions for people. But the proposal is included in the filing. So the more technical questions, I will refer back to our speaker. So one question is, does the Cgpp normalize the utility/zonal headroom calculations across different zones within New York? Howard, you want to take that one?
Can you repeat it? I'm sorry.
Is the Cgpp normalizing the utility/zonal headroom calculations across the different zones within New York? And if you need clarification, if the questioner is around, maybe we could hear directly.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful.
So, can you unmute?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, Oliver Marsden with 1898 & Co. Division of Burns & McDonnell. I was reading through the New York power grid study, not recently for light reading, but about a year ago, and I noticed that there was some confusion, or just rather discrepancies between the way that utilities were calculating existing headroom in areas. And I noticed in slide 5 of your presentation that I think part of the plan for the Cgpp is to sort of wed those headroom calculations to the individual zones and then be able to look at the system holistically to see how much headroom is in each zone. Is that going to be normalized, that process across different utilities, or is there going to be an individual license given to each utility?
So I will ask, there's a bunch of the planners on here, so I believe there is a more formal process that they have developed, but if there's some of the planners on here, that maybe they can answer that.
Good afternoon. Can I be heard? This is
Yep.
Martin. Yeah, this
Thank
is
you.
Martin Paszek from CANET. The utilities actually did that based on the proposed methodology that was issued by DPS, and the utilities did file the first headroom calculations that were done under the same methodology across all the TOs. The filing was February 1st, and next filing will be August 1st. So
February 1st of 2022?
yes.
Okay, great. And where would I find that?
That should be posted on the PSC website.
Yeah, that was an outgrowth. You know, the effort to standardize the headroom calculation was an outgrowth of that same power grid study, and all the work that we've done following up on the power grid study so far is in case number 20-E-0197.
Can you repeat those last 3 digits for me?
0197.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, we have a land use related question from Scenic Hudson. From a local land use point of view, is it expected that the NISO's preferable zonal generation build out and utilities power flow modeling will be information that will or can be used to guide NYSERDA in the LSR solicitations, the New York Sun program, or in local planning and zoning? Let's stop there with that part of the question first. So will the zonal build out, will the generation expansion that's assumed here be used to guide LSR solicitations and other generation siting support programs? I'm not sure that these presenters can answer the question. So I'll take a crack at it. I think we're talking about transmission planning, and we're talking with transition planners, and they are trying to solve some problems in improving on the type of the nature of the transition planning that they all currently do, in order to better integrate, to better predict what we will need to meet our CLCPA targets. So the purpose behind the CGPP is to, as somebody I think earlier said, is to try to illuminate where transmission investment may be needed to facilitate achieving CLCPA targets. And in order to build the models, the planners have to make some assumptions, some educated guesses about where generation will actually be sited. So the output doesn't directly go into the NYSERDA procurement program. NYSERDA is a stakeholder in this process because we want the outputs to be useful, but there isn't a direct connection. Rather, in an indirect sense, outputs from this process may result in a new transmission build-outs, which NYSERDA may want to take into consideration as it's looking at new generation and new project proposals. So that's the first. Does that answer any part of your question? Feel free to unmute.
Yes, thank you. I'm just trying to, bring it down to the where the shovel goes into the ground level. In
Way above that. We're way above that. We're kind of at the, I don't know, maybe the top of the crane tower.
Great, thanks.
I don't know, I think the modelers may be able to answer your other question. Do these models take local land use laws, that may have an impact? Do they take those into account in any way? Anybody?
This is Jason, Liz. So we have zonal limitations around the amount of capacity by type that can be built in each zone. I'm not certain that they're capturing land use restrictions, so say laws around certain types of generation or not, but more akin to limitations around the amount of land that might exist in a specific zone that could actually accommodate for that type of technology. So we do have limitations. I'm not sure that it actually dug down into specific land usage by parcel or anything like that. So yeah, it's a higher level analysis meant to guide decision making. That land use assessment would happen several layers down the road.
This is Idemir from Con Edison. I would just add that land use restrictions is expected to be one of the inputs that we discuss with during the stakeholder process. Separate and distinct from the NISO zone process, we do intend to solicit input on that.
Okay, as part of the full CGPP, once you have the EPAC up and running, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So the next question is from Matt Blythe. For new transmission investment, what level of detail is used to provide cost inputs into modeling? And the example is detailed routing and siting of new assets or just basic estimates, X miles at dollars per mile. Can either of you respond to that?
I think Howard can probably take that one.
I don't develop the cost estimates, but I know it's much more than just dollars per mile. It's much more detailed than that.
Yeah, this question is maybe a little bit jumps ahead of the, there's the planning, which we're talking about here, that is the process to produce proposed investment. And what the commission has said so far is that, high quality cost estimates have to be provided to the commission before the commission can make any final decisions on the outputs, on the results of the results and recommendations of any CGPP. Does that help, Matt, answer your question? Maybe, may not. Another question that I'm not sure who's best situated to answer is how will the non-TO, I think meaning non-transmission owner NWA proposals be solicited and evaluated in the CGPP process? Howard, can you talk about that?
I think I'll defer to any of the other planners if they have any other information on that. I don't really know the answer to that.
I can only say, and I don't recall this specific part of the utilities proposal, but I can only say the commission has said that utilities have to look at alternative technologies, if that's part of your question, so that they have to assess alternative technologies in the course of doing the CGPP. Exactly where and how that happens is a matter of the process steps, is probably in the, or at least hinted at in the utilities filing. But but if it needs to be clarified further, that would be, something that we would look to stakeholders to comment on. If the opportunity spelled out in the draft CGPP is not good enough, that's something we would want to hear from people about. Hoping that suffices. I have, okay, apparently that was a good answer. Okay, good. Any further questions? Anybody want to raise their hand?
Hi, Liz. It's Kevin Lang. I have two questions, if I could.
Yeah, hey, Kevin.
Hi. The first one, just to follow up on your answer to Tim on the EPPAC, is that ultimately going to be a PSC decision as to who sits on it, or is that going to be up to the utilities to decide?
That's a component of their filing. We'll take comment on it, and the commission will decide.
Okay. And the other one is on the utilities slides, page 7, developing input assumptions. A couple of questions on there. The first one is in terms of the data, for folks that are familiar with the NISO process, the NISO has a lockdown period for data because we all recognize that data is constantly changing. But when they're doing the planning cycle, they have to kind of set a date certain for the planning. And one of the bullets on the slide says it's going to be based on current info. But I was just wondering there, are you going to do a similar kind of a lockdown for each cycle to what the NISO does? Or is there a potential that you're going to be constantly updating for changed circumstances as you go through each cycle?
Do any of the planners have an answer to that?
Yeah, good afternoon. This is Jeff Marr from National Grid. So the way we do envision the process is it'll be done in stages. So there will be, distinct cycles, and within each cycle there will be distinct stages. And within those stages, the very first stage, of course, is the one we're talking about here, which is where we collect all of this information. We run capacity expansion models. We get a sense of the build out that we're going to be analyzing, and then at that point, I would expect that we would have to essentially lock that down so that we can move on with our process and complete our analysis to understand what beneficial upgrades may be out there. So yeah, I would envision that there would at least be some lockdown of data after the completion of the capacity expansion modeling.
Okay, thank you. And then the other part of it was, again, on the same slide, on the right-hand side of the slide, the part that says education and cross-training, it says aligning stakeholders and utility planners will improve mutual understanding. Could someone on the utility side just explain what you mean by aligning stakeholders and utility planners? I'm just not clear what that means. Thank you.
Kevin, I think that just means, sharing information, how we're going about the analysis, working together, kind of being open during that process. I don't think it means much more than that.
Okay, I just wasn't sure, so I just wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kevin, it's Liz, and I can't speak for the utilities, but educating stakeholders was definitely one of the objectives the commission listed when talking about stakeholder engagement in the planning process. So the utilities may have keyed off of that.
No, thanks, Liz. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't misreading it.
Okay. Any other questions about aspects of capacity expansion? Oh, wait, we got another question. How will bulk transmission alternatives be assessed? So this is a good question, and several people have raised it before. The commission has said that the entire CGPP should give the commission a broad view of system needs at all levels. The commission has also said that it will utilize available processes such as the NISO's Order 1000 process to address bulk transmission, appropriate bulk transmission, public policy transmission needs the same way it does today. However, exactly how and where that, those issues get surfaced in the course of the CGPP process is not entirely clear in the utilities filing, and we've been asking them to think about that. We've also asked the NISO for their views, and that is something that, again, if people have specific thoughts on how that could be accomplished in the course of the process, we would be very interested in specific written comments on that topic. Another question, which apparently could go to either of you guys. Solar projects growth has skyrocketed. If you look at the NISO's queue, how does the NISO take that into consideration for future planning? Noting that the questioner notes that few of these queue projects are actually under construction. That's of course a problem that we're all very aware of and trying to think about planning to a much longer term horizon than I think has been traditional. So does either, Jason, do you want to, can you?
I can take that, Liz. So the answer to that is, so I mentioned there were 3 cases that we evaluated under the system and resource outlook. First was the base case, which was business as usual. Second is the contract case, which reflects all of the contracts that are currently executed by NYSERDA for all of the projects that have been procured. So I think within the system and resource outlook's current contract case, we have about 2.5 gigawatts, or maybe 2 to 2.5 gigawatts of solar that is currently not, in the ground, that will get added. And then we are aware that a word group for about 2 gigawatts of additional solar was recently announced from NYSERDA. And I believe as part of this analysis, that would also get included. So, it was part of the impetus for creating different scenarios that reflect the fact that there is an active procurement process occurring in a lot of that right now is solar.
Thanks. We have another question from New York Best. How is load considered in the planning process? Will there be scenarios developed for different load projections?
So I would just say that, potentially, I think anything is open for a potential scenario. I know the slides didn't give a lot of detail because a lot of that is really just going to be developed, through the stakeholder process. So there is no, direct answer to your question, but it certainly could be considered, when developing, what scenarios will be launched.
Okay, thanks for that. Denise, did that answer your question for now? Hope so. Yeah, okay, good. Great. I'm not seeing any additional questions
Hey, Liz, it's Kevin. Just one follow-up to that and to Jason's last, if I could, a quick one.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Again, just trying to compare the CGPP to the NISO. The NISO has, which I recognize have been somewhat controversial, their base case inclusion rules. I'm just wondering, in the CGPP, will there be any kind of a set of base rules for inclusion, or is it just something that will be worked out in each cycle as part of the stakeholder process?
Good question.
I would just say, this is Idemir from Con Edison again, is that the CGPP would not be bound by NISO inclusion rules. different from the NISO process, but it's complementary to the NISO process. So there would be certain rules that determine how we build out the system. However, our outlook would be much more comprehensive. And I'd invite other utilities to comment as well.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that you would follow the NISO's rules. I was wondering if you guys would be creating your own set of like inclusion rules for the CGPP.
Yeah, this is Warren Myers, Kevin. The rules are we got to get this stuff generated and onto the system by 2030.
Absolutely. But well articulated, Warren.
Yeah. But I take Kevin's question to be, how much of the inclusion rules will be baked in to, the next written draft on the CGPP, and how much of the inclusion rules will be subject to, post filing stakeholder input. I don't know the answer to that question. Kevin, did I channel you correctly?
Yeah, very much so, Liz. Just trying to understand, what is the basic premise we have going into each cycle? And it's an issue that I know you're familiar with, that we've dealt with in the NISO, that there's certain projects that you either know are going to be there, or in some cases aren't going to be there, but they don't precisely fit within an inclusion rule. And so they're not either included when they shouldn't be or excluded when they should be included. And I was just trying to understand for this process how you deal with those kinds of things, but it sort of sounds like
From staff's point of view, we're not going to put those kind of process constraints on our hands. We want to get to as close as we can to least cost in this incredibly tight time frame we have. So it's not going to be a genteel process, or it's not going to be this new separate little governance structure that you all are used to at the ISO with your free lunches and everything. This is rock and roll, Kevin. We got to get it done.
I'm not objecting to that, Warren, just trying to understand, that's all.
Okay.
Liz, this is Erin. I had my hand up for a little bit, so apologies. I'm just going to jump in. I think you want to wind down. Following up on that least cost aspect of it, I went back and I was looking at the order, and it describes the capacity model being used along with screening criteria in an iterative process to arrive at the most cost-effective set of LT&D upgrades. With that as the backdrop, will the utilities also be running a resource expansion model as well to do that iterative process described in the order?
Howard, any of the utility planners?
Yes, I think that is the goal, is to do that. I don't think we've fully hashed out, how to prove least cost yet. But, that's kind of one of the later stages, that we plan to kind of get through the details of. But yes.
Okay, but let me just follow up with a couple of questions. So when you're describing the time it takes to do these studies, is it the capacity resource expansion model that is the driver of the cost, or is it more, or the time, I'm sorry, driver of the time, or is it more of the other aspects of the modeling?
I've said before, I'm not a planner, but I can answer that. It's the power flow model.
Okay, so I understand we have the 2030 goal, and to have some confidence in doing least cost LTDs, I would think we would get a better understanding of what you folks are proposing to do for the resource expansion model. That to me seems to be the quickest way to look at a number of different scenarios before you jump in and start doing power flows. I think that might address some of the concerns best, if I recall correctly, raised about alternative technologies. We raised concerns about siting in locations and having developers site in locations where it may be cheaper to build, yet if we're burdened with these long-lived costs, that's not serving the ratepayers well. So I don't know if we're going to have another opportunity to talk through that a little bit more, Liz.
To talk through what exactly, the capacity expansion model?
Yeah, and this is where I'm going with it. The expansion model that the New York ISO has is zonal. In the figure, I believe it was, let me see, slide, it was the one where they had subzones. They didn't model those subzones, and I guess maybe I should have a confirmation from Jason that it was a zonal resource expansion model, and these nodal power flows were based on these zones. So I just want to double check that I'm correct on that.
Yeah, you're correct, Aaron, in saying that the system and resource outlook capacity expansion model was zonal in nature, with all 11 zones captured. I think Howard might be able to talk, if you want him to, he could talk a little bit more about how headroom calculations in the way that the JUs are proposing modeling effectively capture subzones in kind of a roundabout way. He can talk through that if you want him to, but I can confirm it's zonal for the outlook.
Okay, and so Howard, the other thing I was just, and let me just post this because you may be able to fill in the gaps too, and having my little dispersed thought process here, is it possible to create subzones in the resource expansion model and run it that way?
I think that's more of a question for Jason, but I think it is possible. But I just want to answer your earlier question real quick. You know, the scenarios that we talked about. You know, we're not going to, we're going to develop those 3 scenarios first, and then run the power flow analysis to determine where there's issues, where there's constraints, and then the idea is, okay, you have these 3 scenarios. You see where there's issues on the system. What projects need to be built to help achieve that least cost generation build out.
So that's the sequence. Your
Yes.
scenarios come first. Scenario development comes first.
Exactly, yes.
Aaron, you good for now?
I guess I'm not entirely sure how that will inform the intra-zonal LTD.
If I'm not mistaken, Liz, please correct me if I'm wrong. There's another technical conference on this particular topic later on, right? To go over how we do the optimization.
Yes, and solution development.
And solution development, right? So there will be much more detailed information on it than Aaron. But I, really appreciate the questions, because first, I think your question allowed us to kind of realize that from the beginning we've implied that NISO would be doing the capacity expansion modeling for us. That's not necessarily true. The three scenarios that are driven by stakeholder input, those in assumptions and setup for those may be different from the NISO process. So we would have to look into perhaps doing our own capacity expansion modeling, or relying on the NISO to do the work for us at some point eventually, but it would be a different modeling process.
Admir, that's really helpful. And I think, again, just to queue up again for the next tech conference, what will be very helpful is to understand when we say how long it takes to run, we have a really good sense of how long it takes. In fact, let me just ask Jason, when you're running your scenarios, how long does it typically take you to run your Plexos?
The model simulation time is not the complicating factor. It's the model setup time for whatever assumptions you're changing. So for the NISO this year, we put together the capacity expansion model from scratch. So it took a long time. And any major modifications to how the database is set up, can take weeks. But simple modifications such as, a high price forecast for gas or something like that, that can, take a day or two to put together. So it really does depend on what the change to the model is and, what kind of database modifications need to be made.
Hey, this is Warren Myers. I just, as a high-level statement, and looking forward to the next one, I just want stakeholders to recognize just how much more difficult and how cutting edge a problem we have put before the utilities, and more difficult than the outlook process than the New York ISO is described.
Right.
All right. We've asked them to try to, and I stress, try to co-optimize not only generation capacity expansion, but transmission capacity expansion at the same time. We rejected their first benefit cost analysis proposal and said, nope, it's a bigger problem than that. We want you to balance more than that. And given the changing generation aspect and the impact it has on the transmission and distribution system, this is not a software off the shelf modeling problem. This is cutting edge. And we recognize that to get this done in time, we're going to have to make some compromises that an MIT PhD thesis might not make in order to make it practical in the real world system that we have. So I'm really trying to impress on people just how difficult, complicated, and new a problem we have. So it's not like, oh, can you do 4 more Keras runs with different assumptions about, policy? We got to get to a filing by January 2023. It takes,
Yeah,
how long it takes to build transmission.
Yeah.
Right?
Understood. And very familiar with the difficulties of the modeling as well. And I recognize there is going to have to be perhaps unknowns, as you might call as a compromise. It's just, the concern is I don't want that compromise to be too expensive. And that's all. I'm just trying to arrive and explore what the options are to see how we can feel more confident in the unknowns.
Yeah, Erin, I think we all share the same desire or wish for a certain level of comfort that we may not get. Given, as Warren says, that it's a really complex problem and there is no off-the-shelf approach. But, just underscores the need for, thoughtful contributions here, and here and in the comment process going forward. Any other comments? Okay, well, I'd like to just take a minute to touch on the topic of convening a small work group to drill into any any of the issues brought up here relating to the expansion model and the scenario development topics. Way back when we kicked this off, we said, look, we're going to run a number of kind of high level tech conferences. If there is substantial interest in drilling into a topic in more detail, we'll consider establishing a small group to do that. We did get a specific request from New York Best to do that with respect to today's topic. And I would like to, solicit from others if there is interest in doing that. But beyond, simply interest, we'd like to know, well, what are the key questions that today's presentation raises for you that would benefit from some more detailed discussion. I'm reluctant to schedule a working group session without really a specific agenda or a specific idea of the things people want to talk about, because everybody, including the utilities, is extremely busy. So to make a working group session useful, we would want to know ahead of time what are the specific things that you all in the stakeholder community think need a little bit more discussion. Any questions or concerns about that? Was somebody trying to say something? So I think, Bill Acker of New York Best, suggested we have a further group. I'm open to doing that if we can kind of zero in on what would be the specific subject matter that we'd be asking our subject matter experts to talk about or to come prepared to talk about. Somebody speaking? Okay.
Yeah, Liz, it's Carl. Can you put me in the queue?
Put you in the queue?
Yeah, to talk when you're done.
Yeah, sure. I'll just wrap here.
Yeah, thanks.
So if you are a participant who would, has particular issues and would like to engage in a small group session, please send your contact information to my colleague Jalila Acey, who's on this call, and you've probably heard from her. Please send her your name, your contact information, and the question or issue or issues that you would like to talk about in further depth. And we'll see if we can get something going based on the responses. That's what I wanted to say. So Carl, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Liz. I really appreciate that. And I think it's been a very informative conference, and we appreciate the participation and work in collaboration with the DPS and with all the stakeholders. As part of our modeling effort for the outlook, we're trying to come up with a model that's as useful as possible to, essentially, to address Warren's concerns and comments. At this point, we have modeled to date a capacity expansion model. We also have a project, in our queued up next year to figure out what the NISO's role should be in modeling and to identify the resources needed for that modeling. And that modeling tool can also undertake a transmission and generation co-optimization analysis. So to the extent that you will be looking for, some information about transmission and generation co-optimization, through the model, also, looking at some iterative scenarios based upon results as we get them. We're very happy to consider that to assist this effort in the CGPP, assuming we get the resources to do it, of course. So the fact that we're not reporting a co-optimization of transmission and capacity expansion in the outlook just means that wasn't the purpose of the study, but the modeling capability we're putting together can do that. So we can actually, rock and roll and get there by 2030.
Yeah, thank you, Carl, and look forward to any kind of help. But as you know, of course, we've got to drive this down to the local level.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And, our model includes local transmission. Now, it doesn't include distribution, but it does include local transmission.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Carl. That's really helpful. So We will be hosting a couple more of these kind of high-level tech conferences between now and August. Keep watching the case docket for those notices as they come out. And again, we're willing to think about doing some further discussion, but we kind of depend on you all to specify what it is you think you need more information about at this stage. Remember, the purpose of the stakeholder process is primarily to help you evaluate what's on the table, and primarily to help you give direct feedback to the utilities, and also to help you formulate comments, your written comments, which will be due in the future. All right, so if you want to participate in a small group process, I'll let Jalila know. And Tammy, do you have any closing thoughts? Are you still here?
I'm still here. No, I have nothing. Again, thank you. And I didn't recognize the ISO this morning, so or earlier today. So thank them for their participation as well today, and all the stakeholders. And again, I think these are very helpful and informative for future process development.
Great. Okay. Someone has just heard what I was saying and is asking what the next tech conference is. I don't, off the top of my head, recall. It may be the solution development topic, which I think a lot of people are interested in. But anyway, we'll get a notice out as soon as we can, and we'll hope to see you all there. Okay. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks for participating.